Ability is who we are in God. We can become whom we choose to be. I think sometimes there's this notion, I know when I was in college, it was always a debate whether or not we actually had choice or whether our genes just provided all of our makeup. Nature versus nurture. But both of those seem to neglect the element of choice. That we choose how we're going to respond to things. Eastern Michigan, Detroit, Flint, Saginaw, isn't the garden spot of Michigan. In case any of you didn't know that. In fact, when Nancy and I served there, it was the crime capital of the United States. In fact, the small segment of Flint that we lived in was the bullseye of violence. There were more murders per capita there than anywhere else in the United States. And it got so bad that our boys, as they were growing up, when someone would ask them where they were born, they wouldn't tell them they were born in Flint. They would tell them they were born in North Detroit. Somehow thinking that that was a better choice. Obviously, they didn't grow up in North Detroit. But you've all seen the pictures. You've all seen the circumstances of Detroit. You can't blame people for being depressed. You can't blame them for being down and out. But I know I've told you before about this individual, and you probably read it. Ben Carson. He was a neurosurgeon. In fact, he was a pediatric neurosurgeon. In fact, he was the #1 pediatric neurosurgeon in all the United States. Born in Detroit. Born to a mother who supported them primarily by working as a maid. He and his brother grew up in Detroit and grew up under their mother's tutelage and grew up in ways that reflected the values that she held. Now, they were out on the street like everyone else. They could have responded in a very pessimistic, in a very depressed way. But instead, they took what they had. They took all of this and they turned it around. And he became the premier neurosurgeon in all the United States. As I was writing all of this down and as I was putting this together in the message, I thought, I wonder what happened to his brother, though. That'd be interesting, too. He became director of engineering for Grumman, so I guess he was kind of a failure. 2 kids out of Detroit. 2 kids in an environment where they shouldn't have thrived. 2 kids that had all the disadvantages that life had to throw to them. And yet they chose to overcome. They accepted their lot and then reached beyond it. They wanted to make change, but they were willing to accept the consequences. Now, this is quite different than the young man we've been listening to on the news lately, isn't it? This Snowden. Thought he needed to reveal all these government secrets. Now, I'm not debating whether or not he did or he didn't. But I do notice that once he decided he was going to reveal those, he did it out of the safety of being far away and under the protection of someone else before he would suffer the consequences. The right means we do it regardless of the consequences, doesn't it? When we stand up for the Word of God, when we look to the kingdom of heaven, we do that regardless of what it will cost us later, because we know that the price is worth it. We know that God is offering us something so much better. I want to read you a quote by Charles Stanley. Some of you may know who he is. He's a pastor down in Atlanta, Georgia. He says, every day we have opportunities to demonstrate our wholehearted devotion to God by loving and caring for those around us. So many people are discouraged and burdened by the hardships and the hurts of life. They long for a listening ear. They long for a helping hand. But sometimes we become too busy to notice, let alone to sacrifice our time and our effort to help them. Jesus told a remarkable story of just such a thing. It was what we've come to know as the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember the story? Man is beaten and robbed and left alongside the road, and you've got some of the top leaders in the country that walk by that road, walk by that poor, beaten man. And he cries out to each one of them asking for help, and every one of them is too busy. Not one of them wants to get their hands dirty. Not one of them wants to take the time. Until a foreigner, an outsider, someone who was declared not even to be a part of the kingdom of heaven, wanders by and he says, I need to take pity on this man. And he helps him. So the question for you is, who interrupts your life? Who disturbs your peace with their need? For the kingdom of heaven is such as this. And what is the Lord desiring of you? What is the Lord wanting you to do? Kingdom of heaven is closer than it appears. You've probably all seen that little inscription around the bottom of our rear view mirror. Objects are closer than they appear. Well, the kingdom of heaven is also closer than it appears. This was Paul's message to his people, and this is mine to you. We go through life in kind of a haze. We delude ourselves into believing that somehow we've got all kinds of time, that there's all sorts of things that we can do yet, and we don't really need to pay attention right now. But God says now is the time. There was a sense of urgency, and so when we read in Luke about sending out the 72, or as another version says, the 70, which represented the entire world, there was a sense of urgency to the story. They had to go right now. And the things that Christ commanded them to do also accentuated that urgency. He said, greet no one on the way. Now that sounds terribly rude. But if you look at the original language, what it's saying is don't dawdle. You're not window shopping here, folks. You've got a mission. You've got a purpose. Get on with it. Get moving. The harvest is plentiful, he says. In other words, there's work to do. Let's get to it. Don't leave it for someone else. Don't assume that someone else is going to be doing it. This is your job, your harvest, and the time is now. What happens if you wait to harvest? Nobody farms? Nobody gardens? Okay, if you leave fruit on your kitchen counter, nice, ripe fruit, and you don't eat it today, or tomorrow, or the next day, you're going to save it for the end of the week. Still good? It's gone, isn't it? It's kind of like that last banana in the bunch. Doesn't matter how many bananas you buy, the last one always sits on the counter, right? Or maybe that's just our house. And it always turns black. And if my wife has enough foresight, we leave 2 of them, and then she makes them into banana bread. Harvest is the same way. You can't leave the harvest on the vine for a later time. There's a sense of urgency to it, isn't there? And this is what Jesus is telling his disciples as he sends them out. First, he sends out the 12, and then he sends out the 70. And you notice it says he sent them to every place that he intended to go. In other words, he wanted them to make ready. for his arrival.